Hi, it's KCCK's Culture Crawl. I'm Dennis Green, and my guests today are here to talk about a couple of exhibits at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And for those watching on the video, nearest you is John Schwartzkopf, an artist whose medium is wood. John, welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. Whose exhibit is going on right now at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And the curator of the Museum of Art is with us as well, Julia Jessen. Julia, hi.
Hi, thanks so much for having us, Dennis.
Yeah, nice to have you both. Before we talk specifically about John's exhibit, just give me the overview of what's on and what's coming at the museum, and then we'll dive into each of them just a little bit.
Yeah. So Against the Grain, the art of John Schwartzkopf is open now. And then we have another exhibition that's opening up this week called All Dressed Up and Down, Depictions of Clothing in the Collection, which officially opens on February 8th, but we'll have an exhibition reception for both that exhibition and John's on Thursday, February 6th from 5 to 7.
John, your exhibit has been up for a while, 3 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And you told me off the air that this is your 50th year.
Yes.
You're considering it your 50th anniversary as an artist because you made your first sale.
Yes.
In 1975.
Yes.
For those who aren't familiar with your work, although I can almost guarantee that if you've been in any nice place, whether it's a museum, art gallery, shop, church, anywhere in the Cedar Rapids area, you have seen John's work. I have always been a fan, and it's so great to have you in to talk about that. But how do you describe what you do with your art?
I do a little of everything. I started strictly doing furniture, and having been part of a show that was primarily focused on sculpture, I decided to do a piece that was a purely sculptural piece. And
this was at the Museum of Art.
This was at the Museum of Art.
Many years ago.
Yeah, it was back in the 90s. I don't remember exactly when, but I joked about the fact you couldn't even hang coats on it or anything. It just was a wall piece. It wasn't functional. But it went to a gallery afterwards. They sold it. I had more people asking about it. So at that point, I started doing both.
So really, in a lot of ways, you have that first exhibit at the Museum of Art to thank for not making the switch, but adding strictly artistic pieces to the functional art that you've done in the past.
Yeah, gave me an excuse to try something different.
When did you first start working on wood? In wood, I should say. Always
as early as I can remember. My dad built houses. I grew up fascinated by the whole thing, and I was constantly building things. And I was the one who did all the model car kits and the airplanes. And you couldn't leave me alone with glue and wood scraps, and I would be building something. And just as long as I can remember, I was fiddling with stuff.
One of the things that I love the most about what you do, two things. I love the way you combine different textures and different colors and different kinds of wood, but also the way you, I don't know, bend is the wrong word, but we don't think of wood as being easily forced into oblong or circular shapes, and yet yours, there aren't that many right angles in a lot of your work.
That's true. Actually, I always like playing off angles and curves. So, and I never saw the necessity of straightening out a board that didn't need it. I tend to work with what the pieces are as they are, not very often doing really strictly formal, very balanced. I always say it's that sort of rigid thing I'm trying to get.
But we think of wood as a rigid thing, and you're making sure that you create it in such a way that it's not. I love that. Do you source your wood? Where do you source your wood from?
I always had a really good wood source down in Iowa City. He retired, but I've also always had some good sources locally. So a lot of the wood I've been using is some of it's from here in town. All the benches that went over to the courthouse, for instance, the county courthouse, that was all from a tree that was from a friend's place off Beaver Avenue. They had to cut the trees, and we salvaged the wood, and so there's a lot more of that. Just wear it up, whatever I run across.
I'm guessing that perhaps one positive thing that came out of the derecho was lots of new material for you to work with.
To a degree, the problem with stormwood is a lot of times the trees twist so much when they go down, and it causes stress cracks in it, which of course you do not see until the wood dries out, and the wood starts to fall apart. It's a more limited source than it might be otherwise.
Julia, this is a little bit of a different exhibit than you do at the museum every day. From a curatorial point of view, you went to John's studio and started looking things over. What was going through your mind as you were thinking, how am I gonna arrange this? What pieces are in, what pieces are out, what's the theme?
Yeah, I too have loved John's work since I started at the museum. So this 50th anniversary of his career provided a really great excuse to do a solo exhibition of his work. And yeah, it was a couple of visits with John. I think I went out once and met with him in the studio, and we just chatted about your life, about your career, gave me better perspective, I think, on who you are as an artist. We looked a little bit at what he had in the studio that particular day, and then he was kind enough to send a lot of images over as well of things that were in storage, things that were in collectors' homes as well, old portfolios, so we could really make sure that we were including both older pieces and very recent pieces too. So in the show, there are 13 pieces in total, and it's a nice span of time. We go from, I think 85 is the oldest piece in the show, all the way up through pieces created just in 2024. So there's a nice trajectory that you see, but also those hallmarks of John, I think, are present throughout his entire body of work. So it forms this really interesting overview of his career, of his kind of principles as an artist, and just really show off his strengths to the best of our ability, I think.
John, this is probably different for you to look at your work through this lens, but when you look at these pieces and from 85 onto the present, what do you think has changed or evolved in your work over the last 40 years and change?
I think the longer you do it, that you loosen up a bit. There's a tendency when you first start out to be overly cautious about not stepping too far across the line. And sometimes interesting accidents, if you want to call it that, happen where you have to change gears. And a lot of the best stuff's come out of that. I always tell people, don't be afraid if it's not going quite the way you like it in the first place. Just figure out what you need to do and go from there, because a lot of times it'll be better when you're done. And there's more of that. I think you have a few instances like that when you start, and then all of a sudden something clicks and you realize, okay, I can be a lot more creative than that, and just go.
Also at the museum, you're opening All Dressed Up and Down.
Yes, yeah.
Depictions of clothing from the collection.
Yeah.
So what was the genesis of that?
I was thinking about clothing appears in artwork very frequently, in most figurative work.
Many people are dressed.
That is
Some
correct.
are not dressed.
That is also
but
true.
Many people are dressed.
Yes, but it can be something that we overlook when we're considering the larger scheme of the artwork. So I wanted to drill down on some of these pieces that have interesting clothing depicted or more detail that's focused in the clothing. Think about what we can learn or see about the artist, the artwork, the person that they're representing through looking at that clothing. So it is drawn from the permanent collection. Mostly two-dimensional work, so again, depictions of clothing rather than clothing pieces themselves. And it's a little bit of everything. It is one of these things where we're spearing through the collection and pulling out different pieces that work thematically for this show. 53 works in total, spanning about 400 years, so there's a lot represented there. And it's all walks of life, too. It's from depictions of poverty and how that's represented through clothing, all the way to high society, movers and shakers, things like that. So it's all over the place, paintings, prints, drawings, photographs, all kinds of things.
Is there a piece or two that kind of stand out in this?
James.
Or when you were going through, this is exactly what I was hoping to get at when we had this idea.
Yeah. The piece that I have on our title wall, where we have the intro panel right now, is a piece titled King of Iowa by an artist from West Branch named Louis Pitchek. And it is what we would stereotypically expect, a man in overalls wearing a cap, and yet it also feels very different, very unexpected, because he's really focused in on pattern and kind of decorative pattern. And so it feels almost uncomfortable in the way that it's being represented. The colors are very jarring, the patterns clash with each other. And so he takes something that is maybe expected and turns it into something that feels very different for the viewer. So that was a piece that really stood out. I was also very excited about a pop-up book that we have in the collection. that features a photograph by the fashion photographer Stephen Meisel, who does fashion photography and has done for Vogue, both in the United States and in Italy. And so that felt really interesting to consider that fashion photography, looking at that piece and figuring out where that came from, what fashion editorial that was from. And it was actually from an editorial where that particular photograph ended up getting cut from the finished editorial. So interesting to make us think a little bit about what didn't fit about this for that particular story. But another example of something different where someone really is focused in on the clothes and is telling us something that way too.
John, do you have a favorite kind of work, a kind of wood to work with? Or is there a kind of wood that's really challenging to work with?
No, it's always hard to pick a favorite. There are a couple of import woods. I like to work with mahogany and babinga and things like that, but I also like to work with walnut and cherry and maple. I'm literally more driven by the piece of wood I have on hand than what it happens to be.
Sure.
And then I'll find things that go with it. Sometimes I'll start with a top because I've got a cool piece of wood. But sometimes I've got pieces that would make great legs for a bench. And I start with that and then figure out what goes on top. It just really is all over the place.
Against the Grain, the work of John Schwartzkopf, and Dressed Up and Down are the two exhibits going on. You've got one still in its kind of closing weeks. Vessels, is that still, that's up for like another month or so?
Vessels is still up. That'll close toward the end of March. And I will be doing a program with Ellen Kleckner from the Ceramic Center, where the two of us will be walking through that exhibition and talking a little bit more about the pieces. A lot of those that are on display are from former Ceramic Center residents. So I think that'll be an interesting conversation between the two of us. And that'll be in March before the exhibition closes.
But you have this week yet some events that are going to launch these exhibits.
Yeah, so the reception, like I mentioned, is on Thursday, February 6th, and that starts at 5. John will be there. I think he'll be in his exhibition chatting with people as well. And actually prior to that, on this Wednesday, February 5th, we'll have John do an Art Bites program for us of the exhibition, which I'm really looking forward to. One of my favorite things about talking with John for this exhibition was hearing those stories of his process and the way that he's able to pivot and make things work and the little details that he incorporates. So I'm really excited about that as well. Yeah.
In the same way that a talk back after a play can really enhance your enjoyment of the show you've just seen, getting to chat with and listen to the artists themselves talk about their work really enhances your enjoyment. You ready for that, John? You ready to do the narration and tell people about the pieces?
Talking has never been my problem.
Exhibits are going on. We'll open up the next day or two, but going on then at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art for some time to come. If people want to find out more about these exhibits, or check museum hours, things like that, they can visit your website, which is?
CRMA.org.
And John, do you have a place online where people can look at your work and find out more about you and maybe contact you if they have a project?
It should be, the website's just johnsawdust.com. Much easier to spell than Schwartzkopf.
This, as I said, I've been a fan for a long time. It's great to have you here in studio, and I wish you the best of luck with that, and also with Dressed Up and Dressed Down.
Thanks so much,
Great.
Dennis.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. You can hear The Culture Crawl live on the radio most weekdays at 10:30, on demand at kcck.org/culture, or subscribe using your favorite podcast player. Watch our videos on the KCCK Facebook and YouTube channels. Our producer is Lydia Kilgore. The Culture Crawl theme is composed by Vivian Shanley. I'm Dennis Green, and I'll talk to you later.